the final, instead of a final talk, the idea was to have a discussion. And I think Katja's planning to lead this, with me planning to lead the second one, but obviously it's open in general. So the topic is really about floral plantings to support crop pollinators, and the issue is who should pay for these, and I guess organisation goes in with that issue. Do you want to maybe set the scene a bit for that, Katja?
Yes, I will. The reason I raised this is that more and more in studies overseas, I have been proposing plantings for pollinators quite a lot in the last few years, and the evidence largely from overseas is that yes, you plant food for pollinators and it helps them, but it doesn't increase the visitation to the crops in general. There are some studies out there where the visitation to the crop is increased, but that's very much when the food, either the floral resource or the timing of the flowering, is complementary to the crop, basically. So the famous example is the blueberry study. The blueberries are pollinated by bumblebees, and they planted things that flowered before the blueberries started to flower. So my question is, should we be promoting this? And if so, who should pay for it? Because if the farmer hasn't got a benefit from it, then maybe we should find other ways to get plants in the ground, which we have to find anyway. So I thought, well, that might be an interesting question to discuss. But of course, this session is also open to people who have additional questions for the speakers. And please join and talk.
So I'm thinking it might be interesting to hear what some of the people working with almonds think about this.
Yeah, I'll chime in. So when I'm not camped out for a month and a half in almond orchards, I've got my New South Wales Government Department of Ag Technical Specialist Honeybees hat on, and one of the top three actually resource issues is the top issue for the beekeeping industry in New South Wales. And so they're always, I suppose, advocating for access to floral resources, but also revegetation. So to go to almond pollination, you have to have a colony that's got a high level of fitness, and the other 11 months of the year, they're transporting their hives to these mass floral events or supplemental feeding their hives. So I suppose the beekeeping industry has a big stake in this, but it's a complicated issue, of course, because in almonds, for example, my motherland's California, so I'm across all these companion plantings and, weeds for bees, trees for bees, all these different pathways. And so as soon as I got here, I was asking the beekeepers, well, should we do a similar thing? And they said, well, you don't want too much going on in almond pollination, because some years, for example, in the Mallee region, white mallee or Christmas mallee will be blooming, and the beekeeper may make a crop of honey at the same time as almond pollination. So yeah, it's a complicated issue, but generally the beekeeper, as we'd all probably assume, is all for it. But I think it always has to be about, the hip pocket, like, will the farmer pay for it or will they not? And if it's benefiting the beekeeper primarily, I think it'll probably become more of a farmer-funded issue as carbon farming becomes more serious. Carbon neutral farms. The ag college that I work from is a DPI research station and is one of the 4 DPI research stations that's going to develop into a carbon neutral site. And we've already been revegetating the site with native pollinators and honeybees in mind. So anyways, I'll stop for now. I could talk about this all day.
Yeah, that's interesting. But funnily enough, I mean, at the end of the day, it's the beekeepers who make and sell the honey. So shouldn't the beekeepers be paying?
Let's see here. Well, they do pay. I mean, they pay land fees. They pay public agencies for access to their apiary sites, which they get produce honey from. And then it's about 50-50 in New South Wales, which produces around 45% of the nation's honey crop. So on private lands, that would be a case-by-case basis in terms of what payment crosses hands. If it's a honey rental, it's typically a honey rental and not a monetary transaction.
Yeah, but I mean, of course, I mean, the honey that is made is basically very often made from public lands.
Depends on what state you're in. Depends on what state.
Yes, it depends a bit on what state you're in. But so but this is specifically about revegetation. If you wanted to revegetate for honeybees, that would be very substantial revegetation, and they'd want to make Australian honey because I mean, you can sell lucerne honey and canola honey, etc., but the value in Australia is Australian honey, of course, which is eucalypt honey mostly, and leptospermum honey. That would require very big revegetation. It would be great to have the beekeeping industry on side there to promote those plantings.
Yeah, just a couple of observations from me. Some local councils, at least a few, have had limited funding to support vegetation restoration. So I know in the Lismore area, there was a little bit of council money towards restoring vegetation around macadamia farms. Of course, in some other countries, I think mainly in Europe, there have been more sort of high-level government schemes that have funded sort of set aside or revegetation aspects. I think we've not had the right governments in recent years to make that a serious possibility in Australia, but maybe it's something for the future. But I don't know whether we would have serious hope of seeing it directed as maybe as pollinators or perhaps just a higher level environmental health, biodiversity kind of thing. But so far, I'm not aware that there's been any significant move on that from governments apart from a patchy local level.
So I'll just put in the chat, the Ween Bee Foundation is a not-for-profit that they've been working with the North American initiative Bee Friendly Farming, and they've launched almost a year ago now. They've launched the Australian initiative beefriendlyfarming.org.au, which I put in the chat. And that, Ween Bee Foundation, I suppose, it was a bequest of Australia's lead queen brooder in the late 2000s. So she donated, any money she had left to bee research. So that's one, I guess, if you want an example, Katja, specifically of the beekeeping industry or a beekeeping industry organization that's backing this. And they do so as well in all their kind of strategic industry documents to back floral resource and increasing it in the landscape.
Yes, their resources are very, very good, and they do promote native plants. They've got these folders called Powerful Pollinators, and that is specifically for people who want to put in plants for bees, not just honeybees, but any type of bees. I mean, they've also got buzz-pollinated plants on their list, which don't serve honeybees very well. So yeah, that is a good example. It is to enhance bees in the landscape, which is what a lot of people want to hear about, not necessarily around crops. Although It is called pollinators. It's yeah, it's I put this forward because I had the feeling that after discovering that it might not work unless it is very precisely designed, which we still need to do, so that it is complementary to the crop and that it provides food for those bees that are actually pollinating the crop as well, then we should maybe not spin a tale saying this is good for pollinators. That was my issue. That's why I raised it. I don't want to sell something that doesn't work for farmers. So I felt a bit guilty, basically, after spending a few years to raise the interest in planting stuff for pollinators, when maybe we have to provide much or gather much more information to make it out, to actually make it work. Yeah. Okay. Anybody else wants to say anything? No. Well, what then? Are we done, James?
Yeah, I think unless there's anyone wants any last minute questions they didn't get to ask or have thought of since for any of the first session speakers, welcome to jump in. I'm not seeing anything immediately, so I think maybe everyone's after a cup of tea and we should take our break and be back in half an hour.